This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial, and usually it's Dave on the board, but we have Bill, and he is helping me to can this program because tomorrow is CCDC annual banquet, and I would like to be there because I have an interest in a specific thing that I think some of the people at CCDC at least might be interested in. We have a closeout of 3 miles of railroad bed between Seymour and Whiteheath. So let me tell you about this. There was a railroad bed that ran from Champaign to Bonneville, to Seymour, to Whiteheath, down to Monticello, across the Sangamon River to Cisco and Argenta and Oriana into Decatur, and then it ran north to Clinton, and it came back to Champaign via Weldon Springs, Lane, Weldon, DeWitt, and Lodge, and then back to Whiteheath. I think I've got one of those out of order, but that's okay. There was a circuit, and when it was closed out, the abandonment, Monticello brought 7 miles between Whiteheath and Monticello, and Heartland Pathways brought 4 miles of abandoned bed, no rail, between Whiteheath and Seymour. Between Seymour and Bonneville and Staley and Champaign, there was a continuing short line, a truncation of the old Illinois Central and Gulf line, and it serviced 2 elevators, or 3 elevators actually at the start. It was Staley, Bonneville, and Seymour, and there used to be a Caldwell elevator before you got to Route 72, and then into Whiteheath. And so for years and years, and probably 30 years, one Heartland Pathways' main aims has been to provide an opportunity for historic railroads to come into Champaign, and our dream has been to bring them right into Champaign. But this is a key piece to complete the rail bed. We would have to put back rail between Whiteheath and Seymour, and we've formed, a bunch of us have formed a Champaign, Havana, and Whiteheath Historic Railroad, which was the name that was used by the first railroad. That organization has obtained a lease from Heartland Pathways for the 4 miles, and is in the process of gathering up some rail trackage to gradually put trackage back on that railroad. In the interim, it will be a trail, and it is a trail. It's clean and people can use it. We had one culvert to fix up, but otherwise it's complete to Camp Creek. We need a bridge over Camp Creek that would make the connection. Sometimes I'm asking you to think 200 years, 500 years, but if we want to do that, then we want to think about acquiring the land in the right way now. Our three objectives are rails, trails, and greenways. And the greenway in this situation is prairie. So already we have 4 miles with prairie on either side of the ballast. The ballast is wide enough to run a train as it used to. The ballast may have to be upgraded some, and ties, not perhaps 2,000 a mile, but a number of responsible ties is quite considerable. We may have to go to concrete because there's not trees anymore. But we have also been interested in the adjacent interurban, because that would allow us to, when we complete the railroad portion of things, to put back the trail on the interurban. So you would have a parallel railroad and a trail. And all of it is unique in the sense that it is relatively undisturbed prairie soil, and there are prairie plants there that are not there by happenstance. They're there by, well, they are there by happenstance because the railroads, there's federal law that you cannot really mess up on a railroad. So by happenstance, the prairie has been preserved. The overall trackage into Champaign is about 20 miles. If you come right down into Champaign, it's further. At the moment, this end of the line near Champaign is reasonably active. It services craft, and it also services gravel west of Duncan Road, west of the Prairie Gardens. And there's a plastic factory that's also served. The Staley elevator has been pulled down, so it's no longer servicing Staley elevator, but it certainly services Bonneville with grain, and the grain harvest is getting to be heavier because the GMOs are yielding higher than regular corn, so people are putting in extra elevators. So how do we go about this? How do we know about this? So I've been asked to say, how do we do this? We've had several situations that have involved railroad beds. Early on, before there was any Rail Banking Act, we bought 33 miles of railroad bed. It goes from Seymour to Whiteheath, and then 23 miles goes to Clinton. If you come back to the Y, there's 7 miles of railroad territory, and that goes to Monticello. Then we start with Heartland Pathways another 6 miles to Cisco. Then Cisco to Decatur is a grain line. And all of that helps to preserve the prairie. It's not the world's greatest prairie. We don't really have any greatest prairie. But this is long and skinny and subject to creatures that can walk along the line, like a fox can get rid of squirrels just by walking linearly. The better conservation areas are an acreage that is enough to allow the ecology to work out for itself. So you have an ecology that is parallel to Route 10 and near to roads and farmland, and so you're subject to some extent of invading uses. And there's also a power line easement, and that can be a little testing, because sometimes the power line will herbicide trees. We try to keep the trees out so that doesn't happen. And there's also roadside mowing, which is often very invasive. So, but we have that, and we have the key 4 miles, and then we would like to have the 3 miles, which is active. That means we would like to buy the line with rails on it. The rails are stick rails, not welded rails, and they're probably not as expensive as heavier rail on main lines, but this one at one time was a main line, so the steel is valuable, the ties are valuable, the gravel on the bed is valuable, and so we're talking about something that will cost quite a bit of money. But it's a regional thing that you have to think about. Champaign is a fairly flat town. It's a flat county. It is mainly corn and soybeans, with a little bit of terrain here and there, like Busey Woods and Brownfield Woods and Treeless Woods, and there's a little bit of habitat here and there. But basically, if you want terrain and you want to recreate on rolling land, you have to go to DeWitt County, Piatt County, or Vermilion County. And gradually we've been getting resources that join these counties, so you're looking at a regional effort. The Kickapoo Trail will be 24 miles from Banner to Danville, and that will access Banner and Champaign to the Kickapoo State Park and Danville. So that's an interesting one. At Monticello City has invested in putting in a trail on our Heartland Pathways railbed that goes between downtown Monticello, across the Sangamon River, across County Farm Road, and around to Applewood. It's only about 2 miles, but it's already very well used and very popular. Let me say something about the rail trail movement. We bought our 33 miles before there was a Rail Banking Act, but we had the same sort of sympathy. We wanted to preserve the rails and the trails and the greenway. Later, the federal government got afraid that they were losing railroad contiguity, and they decided to offer or work with rail trail people to provide an interim trail use. It's perfectly obvious that railroads are mainly interested in the main lines at the moment, but in the future they may be interested in other sidelines. To the East Coast and the West Coast, they've done some of this, but basically the freight that is making huge progress is between major cities, and there's a change in the style of railroading. It doesn't do hump yards too much anymore. It has gantry cranes and loads crates onto established trains that don't get pulled apart and sent in different directions. The whole train is set up by overhead cranes. You can have something like freight coming in from China to Los Angeles and have vegetables go through from Los Angeles to New York in shipping crates. We're still very dependent on road situations, semi-trailers, probably sometimes short-based semi-trailers, so that can deliver to cities or whatever once the railroad gets to its destination. These hubs are about 300 miles apart, so you're talking about Chicago and Memphis if you're talking about East Central Illinois. The Railroad Banking Act was created so that the trail people would get use, and the trail people would have to buy their bed, but the Rail Banking Act would quiet the titles so that there are no reversionary titles at that time. You had to be there when the whips were cracking, but that also saved the bridges, and there was money for enhancement, not for the purchase of the line, but there was money for enhancement. So later, when the Rail Banking Act was instituted, we did a second guarantee to purchase railbed. It was 24 miles between Danville and Urbana. It was Conrail bed, and we took out agreement to do that, and that's been successful, and it's now underway as the Kickapoo Trail. It's in its early stages now, so it'll be a while before you get to ride on it, but the procedures are something the same as what we would go do if we bought a third railroad, and that's just 3 miles between Seymour and Bonneville. I've been asked to outline how you do this. Well, first of all, you have to know the history of the site. You have to know the history of the area. You have to know what the regional potential is. You have to dream, and you have to ask other people for their input. And over the years, that has been fairly positive, and that has supported things like the use of a warehouse in a logical place, or working with the Railroad Museum. Not everyone's convinced that this is what we should do, so you have to balance out, and at this stage we're asking for input from people to give us their thoughts about this acquisition. Then if that is considered appropriate, as was the case on the Kickapoo Trail, then we would be looking for financial support to see that this event continues. The first thing then is to know what you have, and that means you need to know the titles, you need to know all the people who might have concern about reversionary titles, but remember that the purpose of a Rail Banking Act is to preserve railroads, and that's of interest to people who might need to use railroads in the future. So we're looking at an interim trail agreement to quiet the titles, to save the bridges, because bridges can provide a liability. If the bridge is 160 feet off the ground, as one of our bridges is towards Danville over the Vermilion River, it's 160 feet off the ground. If you fall off that, you die, or you can commit suicide off it. So usually the bridges are mandated out. Mandated means that the rule of the game is that if you're dealing with an abandoned railroad line, you take out all the bridges. We were fortunate to take out an agreement which saved the bridges. Now we would want to do the same, and even if we haven't the pizzazz to get through to Champaign, we could get as far as Bonneville, and Bonneville is becoming a western suburb of Champaign, so it's accessible. So you could get to the Railroad Museum. It's probably about 20 miles. There's a little bit of concern that that's a long shot, and somebody has to maintain the railroad, and somebody has to maintain the trail, and sometimes you have to have features of interest where people can stop. The average child does not have a lot of attention span, so you have to think about that. So an old wooden elevator at Bonneville, for instance, may be a historic site. A prairie might be a historic site. White Heath, where there was a Y, might be a feature of interest. You might think that in the future we could go down to Shady Rest, where we've worked with 30 acres of bottomland forest that's also got some rise of the Cerro Gordo moraine, and it goes chew across the Sangamon River and up towards Lodge. 23 miles of this area could be a circuit for a railroad museum. Not likely to happen at the moment, but it's the sort of thing that as people do more recreating and more dreaming, that this might work. But you have to get the land acquired and stabilized now, or future generations won't be able to dream. There's a debate whether we can put an adjacent trail to the railroad itself. That's always a conflict for us, because the unique prairie that we're acquiring is on that 100 feet. There's a railroad bed in the middle, and on either side there's some of the only prairie that we have. So with push goes to shove, we may have to put a trail alongside, still on the Canadian national bed. So you keep dreaming, and you go into Champagne, and you look at Champagne, and it's developing to the north in a surprising manner. The Champagne that we knew 30 years ago was a dead central business district. When we came to Market Street, there were 4 buildings here that were empty, and that was characteristic of the town. So the city of Champagne had moved more or less to the malls, and that has been reversed. So now there is what we call gentrification, and the buildings, the older buildings are being remodeled. Then there's 9-story and 5-story and other buildings being put up, and into the north of Champagne, the old railroad station, which was replaced by the 1920 railroad station, 1923. These buildings are being used. The Black Dog Saloon will be shortly opening in the old railroad station as a restaurant. The co-op, the food co-op from Urbana, is putting in a second place, and it's going to occupy a site on Walnut Street and Washington. And in that general area is Packer, which is a historic preservation association, and nearby there's a new set of apartments. There's a restaurant that's fairly recent. Just north a little, there's the old Illinois Power headquarters, and well, mainly its physical plant and its generators. So there's a lot of things happening to the north where we would come in. We would come in from Bonneville, across Kaufman Lake, behind Country Fair, and along by the casting organization, where there's going to be a second big dig, and down into Champagne. And when we come in from Monticello, you used to have 2 lines that came across about where the post office is. and recently there was a derailment there, and it was decided to join those two lines. There's a line that comes in from Bloomington, comes in near to Parkland College, down by a water company, across Mattis Avenue, down to behind the ABC sanitary hauling, and at that point you're crossing Randolph and State, and there was a connection between the ICG that went to Monticello and the Norfolk Southern that came in from Bloomington. So now the grain that comes in from Bonneville will switch over onto the Norfolk Southern Railroad line and then go on to the Canadian National Main Line. So in the long run, we would hope to join that group of people that are doing interesting things. I also reminded that there's a new pharmacy up there, and there's a lot of action. You just don't get to work with railroads very quickly, but you can work with railroads, and they're mainly concerned with freight at the moment, so you might have to dream a little bit about Kraft Humco, which this week has joined with Heinz to be one of the North American's biggest food processors, and Champaign is one of the biggest factories. So do we negotiate to take out freight on with containers? Do we have a gantry crane set-up so that this can happen? Can we take those trains that you put the containers on? Do you break them into 7 or 8 pieces and take a piece out to Kraft Humco? Do we get our gravel in from Kankakee? Do we get our plastic from wherever? How do we work with the freight? People moving is not very lucrative. It's popular, but it's very heavily subsidized. So how do you work with these freight situations and community non-profit railroad situations? You have a railroad where you can't be a carrier. You're not a carrier unless you want to be, and we've thought about that sometimes, to be a carrier between the like of Monticello and St. Joe, but that's not the purpose of the current thought. We're just wanting to get from Seymour to Bonneville. But at the end of this, if you like to use your imagination, you can think of a historic train coming into Champaign and parking about where the recent derailment was. It might even curl around and park very near to where the Black Dog Saloon is, and where the warehouses are lined up so that trains could park there and unload their wares. So there's a lot of local history around. And sometimes it's also combined with water. How do you bridge various places? Often the drains are parallel to the railroad lines, and if you want to do interesting things, you have to either cover up the drainage basin or you have a big ditch. What is interesting is an old site where there was a building that used to take ice, so you could buy ice It's just been taken down, but it's sort of a historic site, and there's a little opening there which might allow a train to park and allow visitors to be on and off. The rules of the game are that you have to, on a historic train, you have to go and come back. So if you were to take a historic train to Monticello, you might be able to wander around Monticello, go to Allerton Park, do interesting things, and then come back on the train, but you'd be expected to go and come back. This is not intended to be a train that goes one way and that you can hop on and get off for good. So there's all these sorts of things to think about. So once you've thought about these things and know the people involved, some people think this is a good idea. Some people do not like to be thinking that they'll be adjacent to an active rail line or where there are trails for people. And there's a syndrome called rape and mayhem. The imagination is that somebody will come along with a bicycle that can take your refrigerator or your television set and perhaps get involved in rape. And it doesn't happen, but it's a way of complaining that we want our privacy, and sometimes it's in order to keep the opportunity for purchase of the bed for more corn and soybeans. It's a subterfuge, but very seldom is there any problem. These sorts of railroads bring character to communities. They're often a restaurant that had not existed or existed but failed in a small community reactivates. There are bicycle shops, there are antique stores, and universally across the country these railroad beds have been good for economic community. And even the people who have objected to being near to the railroad bed adjacent to it have turned around and they've met the people who are walking, hiking, biking. Their dogs talk to them, they talk to their dogs. They get to be friendly, and give it 15 years and the attitude has changed dramatically, and sometimes the person that's being opposed becomes a person that is in favor of this sort of thing. So we're hoping that we have done our history well enough to know that this is a very positive move. So where do you start? The first thing you look for is a notice of abandonment in the newspaper. Historically, you probably know that the elevator at Seymour has not shipped grain for 2 years because the price of the rental of the rail bed was such that they couldn't afford it. Top flight grain has been moving their wheat at that elevator, their wheat and corn and soybeans, by road. Now that for the community is also fairly invasive of energy use. If you do have a rail, it's important to use it, but it's obvious that it's beyond the capacity of the elevator to move grain that 3 miles. So the first thing is the rent goes up. It's impossible to meet it. The elevator hasn't been used for shipping grain by rail for two years. That allows for abandonment. Abandonment is advertised in the newspaper so that anyone else that wanted to use it for a factory or some other reason is able to apply. The notice went into the News Gazette newspaper on February the 10th. And unfortunately, newspapers aren't read as much as they used to be. and we missed that notice, so we couldn't back up and ask for an alternate use, which is rail banking. But we're not too far behind. If we move fairly quickly, we can ask to buy the line, and usually it's assumed that you have enough money to buy the line. And in this case, you would have to beg the Canadian National to give you time to raise the money within the community. We've done that in the past, and have some confidence in doing it in the future, especially if we have a plan of action and people understand what we're doing. In the era of electronic information, we think we can get information to people to explain this, and we may have to meet with Rotary clubs or cities or what have you to do some convincing, and we think we're okay. And I've already approached the Surface Transportation Board, which is more or less the federal government's Department of Transportation, and they administer the Rail Banking Act. And so if you want to apply, we can still apply right now for to buy that railroad bed, not as a carrier, but as a rail trail, interim trail use Rail Banking Act agreement. That means you have to go to Canadian National, and that means you have to probably know someone who is familiar with the Rail Banking Act. I think the railroad system is very dependent on it. The networking across the country has been interesting for bicycles and trails, but in 50 or 100 years' time, those short lines might be reverted to rail. And so it's important to the railroad company what we do with hiking and biking. So there is a sympathy and understanding. It's a little bit feared at the moment because the rail beds have become so popular with rail trail people that there's a fear that if the railroad is turned over to an interim trail use, the whole railroad might become before the legislature, and the legislature might change the rules of the game. And there's also be a lot of protesting that is not good diplomacy for the railroads. So, these days, some of the railroads are saying, no, we won't do that because it'll become so popular that we won't be able to use it. And so there's one little piece between probably 25 miles between Bloomington and Mansfield. It could be a rail trail at the moment, but it's not being there in case Bloomington connects to Indianapolis and puts a railroad through. And so you have to read the railroads and what they might be doing. So that at Bloomington, that's in the middle of a railroad from Chicago to St. Louis, which is being upgraded as a fast track for freight moving at 110 miles an hour. So there's lots of things to think about here. And our first move will be to see what the community feels about this, and that's partly the reason why I'm moving and shaking this idea right now, because we have a meeting of people who think about these things, the Champaign County Design and Conservation Foundation. Its banquet is tomorrow, and they get together at 11:30 with a meal at noon, and that's just in the middle of when we're doing our Prairie Monk environmentally oriented program. So here I am in the back studio, what we call technically canning the program so that you can hear it tomorrow. We'll have we'll put it on a mini disc, which is almost out of date, but we'll play it back then, and then this will go on to Banner Public Television and to YouTube. And I will get out early and visit with people at the CCDC annual general meeting. If you would like to discuss some of this sort of thing, then call us at 351-1911, 351-1911, or my email is monkdavid0@gmail.com, monkdavid0@gmail.com. And we may have to do this through Heartland Pathways because it's not always easy to take this sort of idea and concept to forest preserves or other agencies that might be very positively disposed but not be able to move fast enough to acquire the land. So often some of the private agencies like the Nature Conservancy will buy this sort of thing. The Open Lands Project in Chicago will do this. They'll step in an emergency and buy the land and then sell it back at a more convenient time to local agencies. So all these things have to be sorted out, and that will take time. In the meantime, I want to say that this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, and I'm doing this on WEFT 90.1 on your FM dial. And I'm very privileged to do that, and I want to say that we're starting a pledge program for WEFT just 2 hours after this program will air, and I would beg you to help do things like have a back studio where I can speak to you at the present time. So I will probably leave some time for David or someone to add a few more words of wisdom. We want to say very positively that these things we say are not the policy of WEFT. They're the conveners of our opportunity to talk to you, but these are comments that are my responsibility or other people's responsibility. I would change dimensions a little bit right now and say that some of the things we're interested in a different sense has been the boneyard, the waterway, the boneyard. And so we've lately been working with people who are students at the university in landscape architecture who have been investigating how they can landscape some of the watershed. And very quickly I want to say that the upper reaches reach into urban territories, and we've had field trips that move across territories that are sometimes you don't even know that there's water and a boneyard underneath. So there's a huge big dig on 2nd Street and Scott Park, and then the Boneyard Creek is covered over at from about 4th Street all the way through to the engineering campus, then it's open again. And so the student challenge here is to go to these various places and see how that they could infuse native and cultivar plants to make this an interesting place. So if you go back from Scott Park, there's a tributary that comes in from the south. If you go to the west side of the Big Dig, there's a big man-sized drain that goes out onto Logan Street and up to all the way to Prospect and beyond Prospect, almost to Russell, where there's been very bad drainage, more by happenstance than anything else. Prospect had a bridge over the drainage ditch, and it got filled in, so there was even a blockage at Prospect Avenue, which meant that if you went to some intersections, you had a foot of water there. So that has been changed with the Big Dig. Then if you go to the other side of the railroad line near MTD, there used to be a Goose Lake Pond, which has been filled in. The little pocket prairie we have has been filled in. It was another wet situation. Now if you're at the Big Dig and go north, you can go follow 2nd Street through to the North End community, the University Avenue. The Big Dig has been opened out, and then if you go across the Norfolk Southern Railroad, it goes into Urbana. There's a detention pond on the other side there, and it's sort of filled itself in with volunteer trees and some planted trees, I think, and there's a bicycle way there. So that's another tributary. But if you go a little bit along that, there's another tributary that goes off past the post office, past ABC, Sanitary, all the way up to I would suspect about Kaufman Lake, and so there's a tributary that comes in there. You got to watch because there's a saddle, and some of this water goes to the Copper Slough. If you go a little further, go along Bradley Avenue, and you'll see that the boneyard goes across and goes up, and it goes all the way to Kmart, and you can see the pipes that come in to provide that water. At one stage where on Neal Street there's an undercart, and some of that water is sent to the Salt Fork Creek. Is a drain, diverts some of that water. The question might be is, can that water be allowed to go through the boneyard to make it more interesting? And I think the answer is, oh no, because at one stage that water was providing a boating situation where you could boat on Green Street, and that would never be allowed again. So, but I think we're getting near to having to stop. So I will say that this is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial, and think about the railroad and the boneyard. And one of the things we need is a place at the moment to have the students show their wares, and so you might watch to see if there's a student exhibition. We have had that sort of thing happen in the building across the way from WEFT, so we've been asked to look at that. So give us a call, 351-1911, 351-1911, or call in, or monkdavid0@gmail.com, monkdavid0@gmail.com, and I'll get back to you, and we'll hope that there'll be other people who will also answer questions. Thank you.